morning, everybody, and welcome back to the URBACT e-University to session 6. Welcome also to October. It's the 1st of October, so the 10th month of this crazy year. Let's keep on working together in URBACT networks. Ian, could we get the slides up, please? Thanks. So today we're going to be talking about planning actions. It's the second session that we have on actions. And today we're going to be going into more detail, getting a bit more concrete. So it's quite a sort of pivotal moment in the e-University journey and reflecting what you'll be doing in your action plans as well when you start going from problem analysis to ideas into really getting more concrete into actions. And Ian is going to take us through all of that shortly, and there'll be some exercises afterwards. Could I have the next slide, please, Ian? Just before we launch into that, I wanted to introduce to you the URBACT digital support team, partly because you've met most of them already now. We have Mary, Ian and Liat, who have been designated and appointed to be the URBACT digital support team. This is because obviously this year we've realized that it's more difficult for URBACT networks and cities to do their work. They can't meet together physically, either you at transnational meetings, much more difficult at local level. And we're all having to adapt and learn how to do these methods digitally online. And it's not so easy. We're all learning as we go, as you've seen, even for us, you know, with a great team on board, we've had our hiccups and fallen over at a few hurdles. So URBACT has developed a number of different support strands for this. We have an online facilitation toolkit, which maybe one of my colleagues, yes, thanks, Steph, has just put into the chat. We're putting into the chat some of these support systems that we've put into place. So some advice, some guidance on how to run digital meetings. In the toolbox that we've talked about quite a lot, you'll see that we've also put digital versions of quite a lot of the tools, or how to adapt that tool to working remotely or in a socially distanced way. And then the third thing we've done is to create this team of experts, Mary, Ian and Liat. Their role is to help you as networks to design and deliver online meetings, to help you to understand digital tools, where to get them from, which might be the best for you to use. And they can also act as online event buddies. So they're available as from now. We want them to work at network level. So the way this will work is the lead partner of each network is able to send a request to the URBACT Secretariat for some support from one of our experts. So please talk to your lead expert, your lead partner. Talk to your cities and see what help might be needed. And then you just have to send an email to Chris in the Secretariat and start a dialogue about what that support might look like. And that could be a support from one expert to one network, or possibly a group of networks together. So this is all what we're trying to do to help you to continue to work, to continue to exchange, and to continue to keep this process moving at local level, to make sure we get action plans by the end of the APN network period. So please make use of that. These great, you've seen how great they are, very, very specialist in all the tools, how to work the tech, as well as how to adapt the way that you work to online methods. So make use of that, please. Can I have the next slide, please, Ian? We also want to have a look at your mirror boards. I think maybe the next one. Here we go. Yeah. So we've been looking at your mirror boards in between sessions to see what's been going on in the groups. We want to just see how your creativity is going, how well the ideas and the process is being used on the boards. And this is also partly a teaser for the grand finale, which we'll have next week. And in the grand finale, we want to showcase some of this learning. So share across the group so you can see what's happening in the other groups, how they have worked, how they've used the tools. And we're going to be looking at great ideas on the mirror boards, in your homework, on Twitter. So please, if you're using the learning memo, tell us about it, share it with us, share on Twitter what you're doing, so that in the grand finale, we can really look at who's been doing what and showcase some of the best results that we've had from the whole 4-week experience. So please keep sharing all of that with us. So next slide, please, Ian. So I'm going to hand over to Ian now. Ian is going to take us through a session on planning actions, so getting more concrete. So the idea with this session is to show you how to take the processes that we've been working on so far and start to really root them into an action plan that you know is going to be robust and realistic when you start moving into implementation. It doesn't become a document full of crazy ideas that are going nowhere. It becomes something that's really going to make change in your city. So I'm really looking forward to this, going into action, and I'm going to hand over to Ian. Thanks, Ian.
Great, thank you, Sally. Great to have so many people here. We've got 294 with us again, which is really great. I'm sure we'll see it tick up over the next couple of minutes as well. So as Sally said, today is about planning action. So it's about getting definite and concrete about things. In terms of what we want to achieve from this, it's about having a chance to explore how we define relevant actions to meet the objectives that we're setting out and to realise the vision we've looked at. To understand and check that our actions are coherent. We'll be digging into the intervention logic that Sally's trailed in a couple of previous sessions. And looking at that principle around how do we move from ideas to action, how do we think about it, and what are some of the tools. So as we've had with the chat to start with, it's all about action today, all about action heroes, and sort of hoping that by the end of this morning, we can help you all to start to become action heroes in your own right, in your own city. So in terms of the agenda and the format, very similar to previously. Plenary to start, followed by a group workshop to test out one of the tools. In the plenary, we'll look at what we mean by actions, how we plan them in that coherent way within an intervention logic, some principles about action planning, and then looking at some of the tools and explaining some of them. So quite a lot of things in there to cover. I'll leap straight in. So planning actions then. What's this all about? Well, a lot of it's about detail. It's about sort of committing to action, to doing something, working out what needs to be done, and moving towards actual activity and actual action. So it's about working out and defining what you're going to do. As Eileen trailed previously about sort of the idea of the divergent and convergent processes, this is really very much a convergent process. It's focusing in, it's making things concrete. So we've looked previously at sort of how the divergent phase, particularly around the ideation phase, opens things up. We've been spending time thinking big, looking at all the possibilities, exploring all of the options, taking away some of the constraints. And now this action planning phase is really into that sort of convergent phase. It's bringing things back together. So it's putting constraints back on, making choices and decisions, adding details, being more concrete, and being sort of definite about what we're actually going to do. So that's the focus for what we're going to be talking about today, is this sort of convergent phase. A quick point linking to what we talked about last session, just about the fact that going through the university, you're doing things in quite short bursts and spending a lot less time on these things than you would do in the real world. So to move from your sort of ideas through to actually planning actions, in reality, you probably develop the ideas a little bit further than you have done in the group sessions. So it's just to note that there is a bit of a bridge to make there, and you probably would spend a bit more time working on those ideas if you're doing it for real in a local context. One of the points to note about that, and about the whole process actually, but particularly about these sort of phases, is that it's not actually a straight line. So we often talk about action planning as being like a series of steps and methods that we work through. But the reality often is, when we try and do some of this, is that it's a lot more messy. It's a little bit more chaotic sometimes. It's not the sort of the linear path that we normally like to go, ideally think we like to go through. But the URBACT method and the things we talk about and the tools we suggest are to try and help bring a little bit more structure to that action planning and make it a more deliberate and iterative process with learning loops in there, rather than just a chaotic mess. So that's the sort of focus for today. It's that convergent phase and bringing things down. So in terms of what we mean by actions then and planning actions. So it's like setting out some context first, and there's that question, what is an action? And particularly, how big is it? What's the size? What's the scale for it? Is it something, really groundbreaking and huge? Probably a bit over the top. Or is it something really small and micro? And I think in reality, we're trying to find somewhere, get the right balance. Now, there's no fixed size or fixed scale for an action per se. But bearing in mind you're thinking about having an integrated action plan, you're probably going to have many actions as part of that. And so you need to have them as a level that's sort of manageable as a plan with a number of different actions. So typically we find actions tend to be things like small projects or medium-sized projects. So sending people to Mars is too big for a single action. You want to break that down more. But on the flip side, writing a newsletter, writing a blog, that's really too small. It's an item on a to-do list more. So we're looking for somewhere in the middle of those. So some examples might be establishing a new youth hub in the city centre, developing and setting up a community safety forum, or building and deploying a citizen health app, for example. I say there isn't a fixed size or scale, so there's a bit of judgment to use in there. So that's what we mean when we're talking about an action. It's some sort of small to medium sized project, for example. The next thing then is that how do we build them? Having understood what they are a little bit, how do we build them in a coherent way? And we need to make sure they make sense. And this is one of the other important things. We need to understand the framework that we're building them in. So there's this thing called the intervention logic, which I say has been trailed a couple of times briefly in previous sessions, and we'll dig into that now to explore that a bit more depth. And this is really about trying to work out how do you navigate your action planning process when there's so much going on. So there's other plans happening, other actions being developed, whirlwinds of activity going on in your city already. And it's easy to lose sight of your goals and your objectives within that. And so the intervention logic is designed to help you do that and to design things that sit within the context of what's going on around you, but are also coherent themselves and make sense. So in the simplest way then, it's a way of looking at the logical links in the chain of this process. So it's about, if we do certain actions, they should lead to certain outputs, and those outputs should lead to certain results. And it's about testing each of those links. So does this action result in this output? Does this output actually result, does this output actually enable us to achieve certain results? On the simplest basis, you can describe it as you can do some stuff, the actions, to create some stuff, the outputs, to change some stuff, the results. So if you take nothing else away from today, just take this simple version of the model away. Before I expand on it, intervention logic is a little bit of a jargony term, and some of you might have encountered this thing called that, but you also might have encountered it in other forms as well, something like a theory of change or a logic model. There's subtle differences between all of those different things, but essentially for our purposes, they're all pretty similar in terms of what we're trying to achieve at this level. There are some technical differences if you get specific about it. So expanding that simple version out then to bring in a sort of a full logic model that we tend to work with, we're adding resources at the beginning and the sort of the vision is the end point at the end of that. So we have this step all the way through of the resources being what you have or what you have available or what you will need or will need to use to implement your actions. The actions are what you do. The outputs are what you create. The results are what happens as a result, what starts to change. And the vision is that long-term change and that how things are different, look and feel different in your city in the longer term. So that's the kind of steps we go through in terms of building our logic model, making sure each of those steps makes sense and there's a logical rationale from one point to the next. Just anchoring that in some of the URBACT components then, we obviously talked about the vision in previous sessions already, but we also then have objectives that we'll define as part of that vision to define what results we're looking for. There's also then a results framework we'll need to create around measuring and monitoring the actions and the outputs and the results, and that's what Bella's going to talk about on Tuesday. We've also got the whole implementation phase, so putting those actions into practice. And then right at the start of that, we've got the integrated action plan, which is what we're trying to work towards building here. Underpinning all of that is the ULG and the participatory processes that go with that, and that cuts across all of this. And just to anchor the other pieces of the puzzle that we've covered in the e-university, the problem analysis we have, which has kind of influenced the vision mainly and to a degree the results. And then we've also had the idea generation process, which influences the actions and the outputs, loosely speaking. So what we're aiming to get to then with all those different components, we're starting off with this integrated action plan. And the idea being that that can chart a path through all these steps. So how we're going to use the resources, what actions we're going to do, what that's going to create as outputs, what results that will mean, what specific objectives we're aiming for, and ultimately what how that all leads through to moving us towards our vision. So we're testing the links in the chain between from one step to the next, and that's the key thing. And to test that logic, we move across from the left to the right. So we step through and say, if we have these actions, does it lead to these outputs? Does it lead to these results? And just to illustrate that, as a simple example, for the sake of argument, we had an action that was setting up a new business support hub. Some of the outputs we might have as part of that plan might be to create a new office, either to build a new office or to refurbish a new office, to train and recruit 2 business advisors to work in there, and to commission and deliver a business accelerator program around that as well. And the results from that might be that you're aiming to get 10 new companies established and also to reduce the rate of business failure within the city through that support program. So with things like that, you're then saying through, well, how does that all stack up? If we have this action of setting up a business support hub, will that lead to those outputs? Will we get a new office from that action? Will we get 2 new advisors? Will we get an accelerator program? I think on the face of it, yeah, you probably would do. If you set the action up in the right way, and that's a key thing, it's easy to miss the right points out of the action. But if your action is defined right, you should be able to produce those outputs from setting up a hub. That makes sense. It's then saying, do those outputs lead to those results? So actually, will you get 10 new companies from those things? Probably. They would certainly help to it. Would it reduce business failure? Yeah, probably it would help with that. Would it completely do that, or do you need other things? There might be a question of whether you need additional outputs in there, and that's part of the test. Do we have all the outputs we need to achieve those results? So it might be we say, actually, it'll do some of that, but not as well as we'd like, so we won't need to add some other outputs in there and develop our action to do that. Or we might need to have a separate action which also contributes to that same result. So it's just a way of testing through, do those steps make sense? In terms of the outputs, it's worth just noting that they can be hard and soft outputs. So the new office, for example, is kind of quite a hard output, particularly if you built it. It's a piece of infrastructure that you've created. The accelerator program is a sort of softer output because it's around support and skills and so on. So outputs are things you can kind of quantify and sort of see, touch, feel, understand, but don't have to be physical hard infrastructure outputs necessarily. So that's the way we test the logic, stepping through from left to right. But when we build the plan, we work the other way. We work from the right-hand side of the diagram to the left, starting with the end in mind. So we start with the vision that we've created from our problem analysis and our stakeholder work. We then use that to define some specific objectives and the results we want to see. We define some outputs that we'll need in order to move towards those results. And then we design the actions to get there and to produce those outputs. And the final piece of the puzzle is then identifying the resources to say, how do we get the right things in place to be able to do those actions? All that then comes together in your integrated action plan. So this intervention logic, this logic model, gives you the framework to think about how you develop these actions in a coherent way. The other key thing it's important for is it really underpins the metrics and measurement side of things. The stuff that Bella will talk about on Tuesday will really draw on the intervention logic as a key foundation stone for building a results framework to help measure results and help make results visible. So all that's next week, but I just wanted to anchor the intervention logic in that process. It's about helping you do the action planning, but it's also about helping you. It's a key part of the results framework. So today we're focusing on this bit about actions, as you may have picked up from the chat and all the various action references we've had so far. The reality is that actions also push into outputs and into resources. So we're kind of expanding that out a little bit to cover some of what outputs are produced and so on, but it's in that space that we're focusing today. So some important principles around planning actions then, to help guide how we approach all of this. One key thing comes from this quote, which the map is not the territory by Korzybski. And this is really about saying if you've got, if you've got a map of what you're doing, it's very different to what the ground is if you're actually there. In the same way that sometimes you model things in a plan, but that doesn't necessarily relate completely to what the reality is when you're trying to implement that plan. In some ways, helpfully for us in our context, our friend Morpheus said this a bit more appropriately for us in the Matrix, in that there's a difference between knowing the path and walking the path. And what am I getting at here? The point I kind of want to make with this is that having the finished action plan at the end of all this process, at the end of your network, having the finished action plan isn't really enough. That sounds like a contradictory statement for what we're talking about today. But the rationale is this, is that actually the good action planning is about the process of action planning and about the final document. So it's not just about producing a documented plan. That's part of it and it's important, but that's only part of it. The other part is that it produces better understanding. So going through the process in the right way and going through those steps and going through all the things we've been talking about really helps you to understand what's going on. So it's about the process and the document, or to put it in terms that are sort of more bespoke for us, it's about the action planning journey with your network and your APN, and it's about the final IAP that you produce. So to just dig into that a little bit, the process bit of planning helps you understand what the reality looks like, as well as helping you understand why your plan takes the shape it does and how your actions fit together in the right way. So the work you've done with Mary and Christoph around stakeholder landscape and all that mapping and the problem analysis helps you understand the context you're working in. And the other parts of the process that we're talking about, and particularly going to now, then help you to understand how all that works together and how that comes into coherent actions. The document side of it helps you get to a single view of actions and allows you to test out a shared view. You're looking at the same documented plan. Do you agree this is what you're going to do? Do you have the same view on it? And it gives you a sort of a starting point of what you intended to carry out, a visible record. So you can say, this is what we intended to at the beginning, and this is where we're going to go. That acts as a communication aid as well, because it helps you to communicate your plan to other people and give them a point of reference to look at. And that can be a physical document that you're holding. It can be a digital document. I'm just talking about however your plan is recorded. It doesn't, I'm not saying you have to have a physical piece of paper per se, but that can be helpful. So the process is a really key part of it. It's not just about having the document at the end, it's about the process too. And that helps you understand how it fits together, how it will all lead to your results. One way of looking at it is the process is about learning and understanding, and the document is about communications and the reference point. So that learning is about learning about the context, about what could be done or the cost of doing that. It's about understanding how you're going to achieve your objectives, who and what will be involved in that, understanding what the risks and all the barriers might be. The communication is to help do exactly that, share the plan with others and get a shared view. And the reference point is having a baseline, so you know where you started from if you need to change something. And the key point there is that if you understand your plan well, you can change it more easily. If you've gone through a good process, you can change it more easily. Now, you might be asking at this point, well, why do I want to change my plan? I've just spent 2.5 years working on this plan. Why would I change it? And it seems like a fair question on the face of it. But the reality is this, is that no plan survives first contact with reality. So as soon as you start to put your plan into action, you invariably find that things come out of the woodwork that you didn't expect, or you realize the context has changed, political change, economic change, or things just don't go as you expected them to. And it means that you're no longer on the course you intended to be on. So you need to adapt. And good action planning helps you to adapt because you understand the plan, you understand why this action was the way it is, and you can work out better, therefore, how you would change it and what the implications of that change might be. The key point here is that your aim is always to achieve your objective. Your mission is always to achieve your objectives. And if things have changed, such as your actions are no longer taking you towards those objectives, your intervention logic no longer stacks up, you need to adjust it so it becomes coherent again. And so that what you're doing is leading you to your objectives. And that's kind of a really key point, and that's kind of where the intervention logic comes in. So there's then one other key principle I want to talk about. Oh yeah, but here's Bruce Willis. Just because, well, there's action going on, Bruce Willis is normally somewhere. But anyway, let's not let Bruce get in the way of some of our principles. The other key point I want to make is that don't choose the actions just because they look easy. And the point here is that a lot of what we're working towards is normally solving complex problems, social, environmental, economic problems that many moving parts, and they're all intertwined. So the reality often isn't neat and simple. And the reality we're dealing with and the solutions and the answers we're looking for are often complex. It's that wiggly path again. It's not a straight line. Now, simple solutions are actually great. They're ideal. They're fantastic. You want to be looking for simple solutions if you possibly can. and here's the but only if they help you achieve your objectives, only if they work. And it's sometimes really hard to be honest about this. You need to be really honest with yourself around, are we doing this just because it's comfortable, just because we'd already started, because we're already invested in it, because we were told to? But is it actually coherent? Do we have a logic model for it that says if we do these simple things, it will lead to our objectives? Because quite often when you challenge yourself on that and are honest about it, actually you find you're doing what the big queue of people in here are doing, and you're following the simple but wrong answers. Not always, but it's having that test to make, to say, is this actually leading us towards our objective? Is this actually gonna work? I'm sure we've all been in the situation either watching or being in a project where you can see actions progressing and you're looking at it going, this is not going to achieve what we want, but why are we still going on? But yet the project still continues and it wastes time and energy and money. So be really clear about, are you doing the things that are going to lead you to where you want to go? So what have we done so far? We've talked about it being a convergent process. So making things concrete, narrowing things down. We've talked about the fact it's about the process, the journey, and about the final output, the action plan, the documentation at the end. And it's about doing all of that within the framework of a sound intervention logic, those logical links in the chain. So what do we use to do that? What are some of the tools around helping that then? So I'll start by saying that most planning tools are based around similar things and trying to achieve the same things, and a lot of it's different forms of the same stuff. So there's a huge amount of different things out there, and it is about choosing what works for you. I'm going to talk through some specific things here now, but that's not to say that's the only way to do it. But a lot of them are based upon SMART principles. So in the same way that Leah talked about SMART objectives in her session, the same principles can be applied to action planning. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. One of the specific tools we can use that we're going to look at today in the group session, I'll explain in a moment, is the URBACT action table. And this is one of the things that's found in the URBACT digital toolbox, which gives you a set of tools and guides for doing the whole action planning process. So that's available to use there along with an instruction, but you'll get to practice that in a short while. Project timelines or Gantt charts or ways of mapping out the sequence of projects, that's another key thing to have in terms of the tools working with your action table. And again, the intervention logic model or the theory of change is a key tool for helping you work through and build it, but also keeping you on track as you go through the fine detail. And then some of the tools we need are actually some of the tools you've used already. So the ideation tools that Eileen talked about, for example, the attractiveness map and the agile dartboard, they are also useful for helping bridge that gap we talked about from ideas into action, but it also can be helpful to keep helping you prioritize your actions as you go through into the detail as well. So those tools can still be used quite deeply into the process. Likewise, the stakeholder analysis tools that Mary took you through are equally useful at this stage, and in fact really important. Because we're going into a convergent phase, we're trying to focus things down, and so we don't always want a huge number of people involved, or certainly don't want everybody involved, because you can't focus when that happens. So you need to perhaps revisit your stakeholder analysis and say, have we got all the right people here? Or have we excluded the people that need to not be involved in it? Have we got the right skills here? Because some people who are good at visions and about strategy and about big ideas are less good at the defining the detail of the action. You often want involved the people who are those who do the work on the ground, who understand the reality, understand the context. And then there's some other more generic tools and skills around problem solving and creativity, just to help you work through, because it's about working through some of the detail. And those are the problem solving skills as you work out how can you make this action work, or thinking of different ways of approaching stuff. That's just really, really key. And one of the most important actually here is just time and attention to detail. It's a focus process, and sometimes you just have to get your head down and work through some of it and make some of the difficult decisions and do some of the difficult development. So what do some of these tools look like in process? And what does this actual process look like? So thinking about the bit around it taking time and attention to detail, it's not always necessarily the most exciting part of the process. It's not always terribly sexy. Unlike these 4 fine specimens who are, well, I think probably the less said about them, the better. But a lot of the principles around this process is around this SMART principle. So how do we get to SMART actions? So this is very similar to SMART objectives, but the language is a bit different because you're applying it to a slightly different thing in applying it to an action. But it's still about being specific and measurable and time bound. But it's also about being actionable for the A. Is that, can you actually do it? Is it feasible? Could you take it off the paper and put it into practice? And is it relevant? So that logic model again, how does it fit in with your objectives? How does it fit in with the result, and so on and so forth, or other things around you? So one of the things that we are going to use to do that is the action table. And again, this is a document, but it's also an aid to a process. So it helps the different things of how it's laid out, help you to do some of the thinking. It prompts you to think about the right stuff, but it also provides you a format for capturing it, for documenting it. So it allows you to do the thinking and record the results of that thinking. Again, it is just one example of this sort of thing. And when URBACT did the study of the integrated action plans from the last round of action planning networks, there were a lot of examples in there of different ways of representing actions and different ways of planning actions. So there was similar but alternative formats. There's a large variety of them which you can search on the website and so on. So I'm going to talk you through this as an example, but it's not the only way to do it, and you can adapt it. As long as you understand why you're adapting it, you can adapt it or combine it with other things that you use locally. But this is particularly about thinking about how it fits with SMART actions. So how does this help us be smart? So stepping letter by letter, starting with the S, first about being specific. Now, the whole document can help prompt you to be specific, but particularly thinking about who, what, how is it going to work. So think about the action owners, the stakeholders, how you're describing and defining the action, and being specific about the activities you're going to do. Measurable, being in terms of, have you got outputs that you can measure? Have you got activities that you can track and measure? But again, the specificity in the different components helps you to measure that too. Actionable, is it ready to go? Have you got the resources? Do you understand the risks or the problems and things that are going to stop you? Relevant, how does it link to the strategy? And how do the activities within the action relate to each other? But also, how do they relate to other actions? And then time bound, probably the most obvious one. Obviously the dates column is a key thing there, but you can also include dates in other parts of it. You can have dates in the description if you've got particular targets there and so on. So that's how it kind of all fits together with the SMART principles. I'll just go through a couple of examples just to give you an idea of what it could look like. You can use this on, just to say, as a physical thing. You can print it out on a massive sheet, stick it on the wall, put it on a table, so you can use it in a physical meeting. You can equally use it in a digital meeting, either on a shared Google slide or a PowerPoint slide, or on a Miro board, for example. It's a Miro board version you're going to use in a little bit in a group exercise. So you can use this equally in digital or physical spaces. If you can get everything onto one page, it's also very useful as a communication tool. You can say, here's my action on a sheet. There it is. That's the essence of what you need to know. There might be other information behind it, but you can sort of summarize it onto a sheet potentially. So what does that look like? If we sort of take a simple example of an action table that's filled in, it's got the title of training with a short description of create training plans, and then it's got other bits of information on it. Now with this one, it's fair to say that it's had all the boxes filled in, it's got something in each space, but is it smart? Is it specific? Is it measurable? Is it actionable? Is it relevant and timed? And when you look at it, the action title is not very specific. The description isn't. The action owner is quite vague. If you go through it, you can see actually most of it's not very smart at all. So it's not actually a very good example. It doesn't really give us all the stuff we need. It might be defined, but it's not captured in here. But there's a good chance if you haven't captured it, it's because it hasn't been well defined. So what would a better one look like? This is slightly more subjective, but if you expanded it and put more details in, it would start to look something like this, where you've got a much more specific action title in terms of the fact it's for schools specifically. The description gives you more details about which schools and when it's going to be done by. The links to the strategy and the context have got specific objectives that it's linked to, and so on. You can see if you look through it, there's more defined detail. It's got more dates in there. It's more linked to the strategy. It's more measurable. So that's just to give you an example. Both of these two examples I've included them on the Miro boards that you'll be using in your groups. You don't need to do anything with them necessarily, but they're there for reference if you want to look at them during the next session. And you'll obviously get all this within the slides as well anyway. So from an action like this, if you've worked up an action table to start to define your action, you'll also be then thinking, well, we're doing an integrated action plan. We're going to have a number of actions here. And then it's all very well having a set of actions all together, hopefully maybe a little bit linked. But then the real power comes when you then link it back into the intervention logic. So you then start to say, we've now got this logical chain between, we've got these resources, which will enable us to do all these actions that we've already defined really specifically and really smartly. And that will help us produce the outputs we need to produce. And using those outputs, we can achieve the results we want. And all of that helps us move towards our long-term vision for change. So that's how the action tables and the intervention logic all work together to help you have clearly defined smart actions that are anchored in a really logical process. If you want to simplify it, again, I say you can do it in terms of saying you do stuff to create stuff to change stuff, if you want to boil it down as a simple way. For completeness, you can also say you use stuff in order to do stuff, create stuff, change stuff. And so in essence, it's quite a simple model, but it's really effective. And it's particularly effective for building business cases, for building funding bids, because it provides a really rock solid description of what you're going to do and why you're going to do it and why it's going to work. And that's the key thing. You can demonstrate we're going to do these things and all these logical steps in the chain stack up. Therefore, we're going to hit these objectives unless external stuff happens. But we also know that, as we said before, we've planned it well, so we can confident we can respond to those external stuff. If all that's still making you think too hard or it's too complicated, again, as I said at the beginning, take away, if nothing else, just the simple version of it. Actions to outputs to results. So where's that taken us then? We've talked about it being a convergent process. We've talked about the process, it being part of a process and the documentation. So it's about the journey of planning as well as the plan. It's doing all that in a sound intervention logic that makes sense. And it's having smart actions that are really specific and measurable and so on. The last piece of the puzzle then is just around sequencing and timelines and so on. So it's important along with all of that to have some representation of how things are going to be ordered and sequenced. And again, there's a million different ways of doing this, a million different examples. If you need support with it, I or others can certainly help with that. I've thrown up a couple of examples here just to illustrate the point, but it's something that has some sort of visual timeline, some sort of visual Gantt chart to help you see and communicate the overall flow of your actions and your activities and your milestones, where they happen, where they fall, and importantly, how they interrelate, which ones are dependent on others, where might there be conflicts. You can represent it in this sort of way. If the context is right or it's simple enough, you can represent it in a different sort of way on a spreadsheet or a word table with dates down the side or across the top and so on. So there's different ways of doing it. And this sort of approach is easier sometimes if you've only got a small number of things. If you want to show something more complex, sometimes the visual thing is easier to do. Go with what works for your situation. I often use both combined together. So you have some of the detail in the table and you have the timeline as a communication visual, and you can use those together to get both benefits. As I say, the point I want to make is it's important to have sequenced and thought about that sequencing and recorded that somewhere as well. So that gives us the full picture then of this convergent process, which is making things concrete, about the process and the documentation working together, doing that in a sound intervention logic that's coherent and makes sense, smart actions that are sequenced in a clear timeline. So that's the essence of it. That's the kind of the core parts of it, really. Before we step in, I'll talk through the workshop in a moment in terms of what that's going to look like. Before we step into that, as has now become a tradition, I think we need a little bit of movement, and particularly we're talking about actions today. We definitely need a little bit of actions and movement to sort of loosen this up a bit. So you've seen some stretching already. You could try some of what this guy's doing on here if you're feeling really energetic, or just stand up and give yourself a bit of a stretch. I'm already standing, so I don't kind of need to stretch my legs, but give yourself a right stretch out if you need to. What I quite like doing is sometimes you can run up and down the stairs to get yourself going. If you haven't got stairs to hand, you can make some. You go for a walk down the stairs and run back up again. So yeah, just take time to take a moment to just move around a little bit, take a deep breath, just sort of get some blood moving again back to your brain in case my presentation has drained it all out from your brain in the last half an hour or so. So the group workshop then. Hopefully none of you are bouncing around your living room, beating the hell out of your child's stuffed toys from the inspiration there. The group workshop is sort of split into two parts. It's focused on the action tables. So it's in two main parts. The first bit about reviewing and critiquing some pre-completed action tables. So this is like a sort of a peer review exercise almost. So treat it as if you're doing a peer review of another city's action tables. The content's kind of random. They're just examples to kind of give you something to work with. But that allows you to work through first individually and then as a group to understand what you think of these different action tables, what makes them good, what makes them bad, etc. And the second part is completing a blank action table to turn one of your ideas from your last session into a more concrete action. So I'll just talk through exactly how that works. When you get into your groups, your facilitator will help you assign you to one of 3 different action table examples, and you'll work on one. And all you need to do is a bit of time, sort of 6-8 minutes to start with, quietly on your own, just review the action table, read it through, see what's there, see what you think of it. It's about just having some time to form your own opinions. And then identify which parts you think are good, which parts you think could be better but are okay, or which parts you think are poor. And you can mark those up on the action table with the sticky notes on the board. So use the relevant color sticky notes, say this bit's good, this bit's okay, this bit's rubbish, and so on. You might have different opinions to other people in your group. That's fine. Actually, it's useful because it prompts discussion. The key thing here is it's not a test. We're not trying to see if you got the right answer. The discussion that follows is the important bit. This is just to give you some time to think about it and to mark up where you might want to talk about that's interesting. Some people might put 95 stickies on. Some person might put 1 on. That's fine. Just need to have something to work with to start the discussion. So then the following bit then is, as a group, is then saying, okay, let's look at all these stickies on the action table and have a discussion about why we've put different colored stickies in different places. Why do we think this one could be improved? What makes this one good? Why is this one poor? And also, how could we improve it? What would we do to make it better? And then having done all that, that should hopefully help you to get an idea of what good looks like. It's often easier to do that when you're looking at it in as an example with something to reflect on, rather than trying to start from scratch and work it out. But then the second stage of it is to take that thinking and to, as a group, create an action table for an idea from your last session. What I would say is don't spend too much time picking the idea. Potentially focus on one that was from your quick win quadrant or your gold mine quadrant of the assessment matrix, because they're likely to be the more easy ones to work through. The idea is to have one that you can probably feasibly have an idea about and work up an action table. If you go for a moonshot one, you might have to spend your whole time thinking, goodness, how are we going to do that? So go for one of the quick wins or the gold mines. Your facilitator can help you with this as well. Let's discuss it as a group, but don't spend too long choosing. And then you can build that action table up on the Miro board using sticky notes, using text boxes, pictures, however you like. What it looks like is up to you. Just think about getting the information there, talk in the group about how you would make that a concrete action from that idea. Think smart all the way through. So for when you're building your own table, how could you make it more specific? How might you make it more measurable, etc. And when you're critiquing the other one, also think smart as well. Is it specific? Is it measurable? What feedback would I give to another city about how smart it is and how they might improve? So that's the exercise in a nutshell. I'm going to hand back to Sally now just to take us through the next steps before we move through and just to wrap things up. So Sally, back over to you.
Thanks a lot, Ian. That was a great presentation. Amazing. Lots of clarity about how we put together an action table and why, and great comments in the chat. So thank you so much for that. A lot of appreciation for the Big Bang Theory crew in their superhero outfits. Thanks so much for that. And some people not believing that I did a backflip during the stretches. Well, look, here I am. I'm not on the way to A&E, as somebody said in the chat. So just to reinforce some of the comments that came out and what Ian has said before we move into the groups. The intervention logic, that's a kind of a jargon phrase that's used particularly with cohesion funds, but you might recognize quite a lot of what Ian has said as a process that you use anyway when you structure your projects and in a way that's measurable. So please, adapt what you do already. We think a lot of you will actually be familiar with quite a lot of this. And just to say, in that last session, of course, the PowerPoint and the recording will be up on the eUniversity website, so you can go back over it, also perhaps with your local group if you need to at any time. And we think the sound dropped a little bit a few times. Again, if that happened, you can go back to the recording on the website. And I think it's just for a few people, same issue as we had last time. And finally, Steph put in the chat the study that was produced last year on the first round of action planning networks. And it has some great examples of action tables in there. So we have the action table template on the toolbox. You can use that, but you can also adapt it to show other connections, other sort of categories. So we'll make sure you've got, you can access all of those resources by the end. So now it's time to go to your working groups. We'll do the usual thing, find your personal link, go into the waiting room, A, B, or C, hold tight and get your coffee. And at 11 o'clock, in just under 10 minutes, we'll assign you to your working group. We're going to have 50 minutes in the working group because this task, there's 2 steps to the task. And then Ian and I will welcome you back to plenary at 11:50 for 10-minute recap just before the session finishes. Same thing again. If you find yourself alone in your group, wait for others. And if you're not allocated to your working group from your waiting room, just hold tight and we'll be able to do that individually. So thanks a lot, Ian. Brilliant presentation. Now let's get to work and see if we can actually make our own action tables in the working groups. Thanks a lot. Welcome back, everybody, back into plenary. Hope you enjoyed your working groups. Hi there. That's a nice smile and wave. Ian, were you looking at the mirror boards to see what was going on?
Yeah, I was just seeing what was happening as people were working through. So yeah, it's interesting to see a lot of different views. You know, we saw several places where there was red and green next to each other on the board. So I think that hopefully sparks some useful debate. Because as I said, there's not right answers, and it's also about perspective in terms of what you expect to have locally as well. So yeah, that looks quite interesting.
Could you show your slides, Ian?
Yep.
And we're getting people coming back in the chat saying it was short. Yeah, great exercise, but maybe not so much time. And in group 20, it was awesome, but they needed way too short. So I think it's quite interesting. All the exercises we're doing at speed. I mean, this is part of what the e-university is about, sort of simulating at speed what you might want to do at local level and how these exercises work. But to give you a taste of how they work, a framework for doing them. But we really appreciate that we're asking you to do a lot in a short time. Oh, everybody's talking about it. Sorry about that. We really tried to get you to do a lot there in a short time. But thanks for trying, everybody, and getting stuck into it. And I mean, you could go back into the mirror boards and play with them again if you wanted to in the interim. Yeah. So Ian, perhaps we could come back. We don't have a huge amount of time, but perhaps we could come back to any reflections from the plenary and the couple of questions that we had that came up in the plenary. One was about how do we create action tables that interrelate or make sure we don't lose the integrated approach when actions maybe need to be connected to each other. And also a second question about the complexity of timelines. You used an Excel spreadsheet and somebody asked, how would you record more complex timelines? What's the best tool for that?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it sometimes is about going different layers within it. It depends what you need it for. So as I said, having a clear, succinct visual is helpful, giving you an overview. But if you want to get into the detail of that, I mean, some of the project management software you can get, and some of you can, I can't remember the names of things off the top of my head, but you can get free ones as well as paid ones, which allow you to input all the details into a table style, add detail to that. But from that, it will generate a timeline. And some of them, the better ones now, are getting quite nice visuals as well. So you can use those sort of things. Obviously, when you're into more detail, it's a bigger job to manage it. So you do have to spend more time doing things like that. You can just use a more complicated spreadsheet if you want to. It just, you know, again, with all these things, you can add layers of detail behind it. You can add extra columns and extra information to keep track of it. It's as much about the process that you use around the tools as well, though. So the tools themselves won't track it for you. They can help. They're a support mechanism, but actually you have to have a conversation about your plan. You have to talk with colleagues about what's happening. You have to review it. You have to see where are the links, where are the conflicts, how do we resolve some of those things. So yeah, it's with all of this, and this is what I was trying to get across through a lot of my presentation, the tools are there, but unless you use them in the right way, actually they don't achieve what you want. It's that mindset about how you're thinking about it and how you're working with colleagues as much as the tools, but the tools can certainly help you.
Right. Thanks for that. And I think maybe if others know of good tools, please tell us, put them in the chat or add them to the URBACT toolbox, because we need to help each other with finding the right ways to capture this, especially complex action tables and complex timelines. So please, let's crowdsource and help each other to find the right mechanisms for that. And again, the study of the integrated action plans from the last round has got some really good examples of how cities try to sort of combine different actions and show how they're linked to each other. So please do have a look at that. And we've got Annika saying Trello and Asana. That's great. Thanks, Annika. People telling us in the chat good tools that might be useful for us to think about. The one thing that Ian and I also wanted to come back to as well is about, you noticed on the action table, there was a box at the top about resourcing and financing and funding. So of course, we want all of the action plans to be resourced, because in order to be implemented, they're going to need that. And we haven't focused on it too much right now in the e-university, because this is the phase when you're getting into the integrated action planning. But we will try to help you to keep thinking and triggering the thought, how are we going to fund this? How might we fundraise? What resources do the city have? What resources might there be at European level through cohesion funds? And in about a year's time, we'll maybe come back to that and do some more capacity building across the whole of the action planning networks to help you to think about the resources and different ways in which you might finance or fund your action plans. So Ian, any more comments from you coming in from the chat? And then I'm going to hand over to you to do the wrap up and handover.
No, I think if we've got, we're probably short on time, so we need to keep our actions moving forwards. Yep. So yes, I mean, yeah, we appreciate that the time is short for these things, and all of these processes, particularly action planning, the action tables. You can spend a huge amount of time working through all this. This is like some of the really core parts of the process. So it does take longer than 45 minutes, 50 minutes. We absolutely accept that. But hopefully you've had a chance to get your head around it and see how it can be used and how it can be positive. I think just to summarize again, what the sort of key points from this is that this is a convergent process. You're having to make some hard decisions and exclude some stuff, focusing down onto the key things. I think Christoph made a couple of comments to us earlier about, yeah, it's about actually not having a whole load of random actions and trying to do everything, but being really clear about which ones you can focus on. It's about really embracing that journey, that learning and understanding journey as part of the planning process, and then using the right tools and the right structures and the right visuals to help bring your documentation together, to have a good visual aid and a big communication aid. Really look at that and think hard about the intervention logic, thinking back to, are we being honest about whether the logic really stacks up, challenge ourselves about whether things are really going to achieve what they want, keep focused on the objectives as they're the things you need to be achieving. Smart actions. So yeah, I think this theme keeps coming up again and again, but it's just a really simple but effective way of keeping things focused and keeping things at the right level of detail, making sure we're not being vague and risking things drifting off. And again, timelines and sequencing, making sure it's all fitting together as part of that convergent process to map out the route. So again, just wanted to just re-highlight and stress those key things. Do think about the homework. You've obviously got the learning memos again. Think about what you might start doing, what you might stop doing, what you might continue doing, and there's some further prompts on there to think about how you can use what you've picked up today. If you get the chance now, spend 2-3 minutes doing that. It's really helpful to do whilst it's fresh, even if you plan to come back to it later. It can be really helpful just to structure that. And hopefully we've all started on a journey to becoming our own version of an action hero, whatever that means for you locally. Even if you're not a fully fledged action hero yet, maybe you've started on the process towards it, and you can help to build your skills around this in terms of as you go through action planning. So yeah, thank you for your participation, your comments, your engagement in the chat and in the groups today. I think the last thing to do really is just to hand over to Bella with the help of Superman. Bella, over to you.
Thank you, Ian. Wow, it was really great. Next Tuesday, we will come to the last piece of the action planning puzzle, making results visible. And the title already implies that the results are not always visible. And indeed, in my experience, that's often the case. In the past almost 10 years, I read many integrated action plans, and even in the best ones, indicators often are either completely missing or they are just barely there. So on Tuesday, we will speak about the importance of making results visible and how it fits the action planning cycle. We will also revisit the intervention logic and the results framework and make sure that you can actually design your own set of indicators and put a simple monitoring framework in place for your action plan. As you know, we are approaching the end of the university, but hang with us next Tuesday and let's make the invisible visible together. Thank you. See you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Bella and Ian, our supermen today. So see you next Tuesday, everybody, for Bella's session. Bye for now. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, Ian.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Thanks, you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.